Okay, so Robbers Cave experiment. Oh, by the way, people point things out to me over email. They correct me on things. Sometimes they're little things. I don't bring them to class. Sometimes they're big things. A big thing, I apparently said that Freaks and Geeks is a movie. I said that in the last lecture. It is not a movie. It's a television show. It's weird I said that because it's like my favorite television show of all time. And if you haven't seen it, I highly encourage that you do so. If you do, then you'll automatically get an A+ in the class. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Oh, I'm kidding. I don't like it that much. Okay, if I get your attention. If I can get your attention. Okay, so let's wrap up the social identity theory lecture. So where we left off, you all were trying to leave, and I was talking about the end of the Robbers Cave experiment. And at the end of the Robbers Cave experiment, let's see here, what happened? They brought these people together, these groups, the Rattlers and the Eagles, who had previously hated one another, and had them work on common tasks together. And among these common tasks were, they had to, what'd they do? They had to work on non-trivial problems, including the water problem, where the Vandals had cut off the water supply for the entire summer camp. And they also had to go get a movie, and it required more money than either group had alone. And they did, a few other things, like they had to cut down a dangerous tree or something like that, and they had to get a truck that was stuck in the mud out of the mud, or else they couldn't get the supplies from the nearby town so they could eat that night. Basically, the camp counselors and the experimenters set up these clever little situations that would force them to have to come together and cooperate. And in coming together and cooperating, the groups came to love one another, which is very sweet. They ate together, they sat together voluntarily at dinner. That's redundant. Eating together and mixed eating at dinner, that's the same thing. They decided that they wanted to return to Oklahoma City on one bus instead of two at the end. And then they cheered when the staff said, okay, sure, you can do that. And then they sat together on the bus, Eagles next to Rattlers, loving one another. And then at the rest stop on the way back, the Rattlers decided to spend the $5 they'd won in the bean tossing contest on malted ice cream shakes for everybody. Do you all know what those are, malted ice cream shakes? They're very good. They were big in the 50s. Okay. So that's how deeply connected they were. They actually shared ice cream with one another. And if you've ever seen like Eddie Murphy's Delirious, you know what a rare thing that is for children to share ice cream. Okay, so it would be like adults giving money to one another. It's like that rare of a thing. So conclusions. Separation and competition between groups can generate intergroup conflict, but then cooperative pursuit of common goals and shared success in tackling those goals can then foster solidarity, cohesion, and liking. And this is actually a graph from This is a graph from the Sharif's actual study, which shows that before, this is the rate of Eagles having best friends that are Rattlers, and the rate of Rattlers having best friends that are Eagles. I love that these kids thought they were just going to summer camp, and then it turns into these bar graphs like 70 years later in social psych classes. How weird is that? Less than 10% of them had best friends in the other group, but then, by the end, after the integration period was over and they'd worked on these common tasks and been brought together, by this time, Eagles, at a very high rate, above 20%, there's a doubling of the rate of best friends in the other group. And you can't even see the end of this bar because it's so enormous. You don't even know where it ends. And indeed, we don't know where it ends. It's just joy and love and best friends forever. Actually, it's 35% is what this one is. So it goes a little bit past there. Yeah. Okay. So there's this increased rate of having best friends in the other group because they came to really like the other group. So some conclusions about social identity theory and intergroup conflict that comes out of this lecture we did like weeks and weeks and weeks ago. Okay, so one, the accentuation effect helps explain outgroup stereotyping. If you remember, the accentuation effect was the tendency to see objects of any sort, be they humans or even just immaterial objects, to see them when they're presented as being in different groups, as being very similar within the groups, and then very different between the groups. That all you need to do is just have some objects presented as in different groups, and then you'll tend to say, oh, they're about the same in the group, and they're very different between the groups. It's this kind of natural human tendency called the accentuation effect, and it's one of the reasons that we have outgroup stereotyping in humans, right? As you think, I'm in my group, we must all be pretty similar. They're in their group, they're all about the same, and they're very different from me, or rather us. Also, the minimal group experiments show that you can make a group out of even trivial differences, like taste in abstract art, and that people will allocate more resources to their in-group and than they will to the out-group. And they'll even try to maximize the difference between the in-group and the out-group, because even trivial bases of group differentiation, like Eagles, Rattlers, Kandinsky versus Klimt painting preferences, can trigger group competition. Also, this Milgram replication, where they manipulated in the experiment whether the target of the shocks was white or African American, shows that group differences can create even violence towards the outgroup when that group differentiation is made salient. And then the soccer study, the Levine et al. Study, showed that people help in-group members more than out-group members, but it also showed that what you define as your in-group is heavily contextual. It's highly relative to situational cues. Remember that when they're in the study and they're told, or they're given a survey which forces them to strongly identify as Manchester United soccer fans, football fans, then they help Manchester United fans a lot, and they don't help the out-group, the Liverpool soccer fans much, and they don't help somebody who isn't even a soccer fan at all, who's just wearing a white t-shirt. But if they're made to identify as football fans, then they'll help both the Manchester United fans and the Liverpool fans, and then they just don't help that poor schlub with the white t-shirt. But the point is that depending on the context and what identity is made salient, you'll define your in-group either more narrowly or more broadly. But you'll always not help somebody wearing a white t-shirt, I guess. Okay, some other conclusions based on the social identity theory lecture. Research on student groups at UCLA shows that they promote, that student groups at UCLA anyway, promote within-group identification, reduce common identity across groups, and foster also perceptions of intergroup persecution. Then also the Robbers Cave experiment, perhaps the best experiment that we talked about this semester, in this section of the class. Everybody loves the Robbers Cave experiment because it's rich with qualitative observations about the nature of intergroup conflict. The Robbers Cave experiment shows that pursuing a common goal creates group identification, and then group competition can create intergroup animosity, but then a common goal at the end and cooperation across groups can also unite groups. I've now said that 3 times, so that should be clear. And for some reason, I guess I didn't make that yellow, so you probably didn't see any of that. So I encourage you to download the slides off of BSpace so that you can see what I was just talking about. Okay, are there any questions about the social identity theory, about this material? Okay, so let's wrap up the status lecture. And where were we on the status lecture? We had just finished talking about research on the motherhood penalty, which showed that motherhood is a basis of status differentiation in our society. And mothers in the labor market are presumed to be less competent and less committed to their jobs. And this is demonstrated both through laboratory experiments, but also a field experiment that was conducted with real employers in New York City, where they mailed out applications and saw the rate of callbacks they would get. And they find that women who are mothers, even if you control for everything else about them, about their resumes, about their qualifications, they tend to do much worse. But then men who happen to be parents, men who are fathers, as compared with men who are not, they do better. They actually improve in terms of how the salaries they're offered, the rates of promotion that are reported by subjects in the study, interest from New York City employers in hiring them. They actually do better. And why is that? Well, I was offering you a possible explanation that maybe the generally positive stereotype of men in the labor market, or impression of men, we'll talk about stereotypes after this exam, but whatever. This generally positive impression of men in the labor market is not perfectly positive. There's some things that maybe we don't trust about men, or we think they're really competitive or excessively ambitious, or maybe we'll leave this firm and jump to another. But then when they're fathers, it counteracts a lot of those few demerits in that generalized impression of men in the labor market. Okay. So moving on, more research on status-based discrimination before we turn to a study on how status can integrate groups. So how many people here are familiar with Diva Pager's research on racial discrimination in the labor market? Okay, so many, many, many of you. Okay, so nonetheless, I'll try and build it up from the beginning and set up the problem that she was trying to answer for those of you who don't know DivaPager's work. So DivaPager started with a fundamental question, which is, does discrimination persist in the U.S. job market or in labor market? And specifically, does racial discrimination persist in the U.S. labor market? We know that it did 50, 60 years ago, but it's hotly debated now whether or not it persists, whether there's still discrimination. I know a lot of you are like, really? That's hotly debated now? Yes, it actually is. So many people, many academics say, no, there is no more discrimination left in America. The labor market now functions on almost purely meritocratic basis, where people are sized up based on their credentials. They're not perfectly evaluated, but people don't rely on things like race and gender as cues of competence or as bases of discrimination. So especially economists who study labor markets tend to claim that discrimination can't exist because it would be eliminated by market forces. And their argument is elegant, I think. So their argument for why discrimination doesn't exist is that if you have a firm A and you have firm B, and firm A discriminates and doesn't hire African Americans, doesn't hire women or homosexuals who are equally qualified or more qualified sometimes, right, than their white male counterparts, then overall this firm is going to have a relatively incompetent labor force compared to this firm that does hire just the most available the best available applicants, right? So if this firm is willing to hire women, willing to hire members of minority races, they're going to do better in the long term. And this firm, firm B, the one that is egalitarian, will win out in the course of labor market competition. And firm A should either waste away and die away, go bankrupt, what have you, or switch their strategy in order to keep up with firm B. Can those of you in the very back there stop talking, please? Very back row. You're paying so little attention, you don't even know I'm pointing at you. There you go. Okay. Firm B should do better and eliminate firm A from or at least force firm A to switch their strategy to an egalitarian hiring one because it's a better business. So economists say, based on this reasoning, it is therefore impossible that discrimination persists in the labor market despite abundant empirical evidence that it does. It's theoretically impossible, therefore you must deny the empirical data, the facts before you. It's a very clever argument. Sociologists point to data that shows that women still make less money than men, blacks make less money than whites, and Latinos do as well, and so on. And they say, well, sure, you make this theoretical argument, but the evidence says otherwise. But there's many answers to the data that the sociologists present, to be fair to the economist side. The sociologists are presenting these data, and it could be that other things explain the differences. Economists say maybe whites really are more credentialed for whatever reason, or maybe men, because they don't have to take stays out of the workforce to have children, or they take less time to nurture children, then maybe that's a critical step where women leave the workforce and then don't accumulate credentials where men do. And if you could accommodate, if you could account for that, then you wouldn't have much of a gender wage gap anymore. So it's a hotly debated issue, and indeed, no side has a slam dunk answer on this, on whether discrimination exists or not, because it's really, really, really hard to demonstrate. So who's right in this argument? And let's specifically talk about racial discrimination. I would argue that what's most needed is an experiment, right? You want an experiment where you hold everything constant, except you could manipulate the race of a job applicant and then see, when they have a certain race, do they get allocated higher salary, higher chance of promotion, better chance of getting a job, or what have you, than when they have another race. This is the perfect answer to this question, right? You're curious if the independent variable has an effect on the dependent variable, then manipulate the independent variable while holding constant all other independent variables, all confounding variables, and see if it has an effect on the dependent variable. So what you could do is you could take two job applicants with identical credentials, but one is white and the other is black, and ask and study whether the white applicant will be more likely to get the job. I don't know why I said that was similar to the Levallois et al. Study. Oh, yeah, in a complicated way I don't have time for. Okay. I'm sorry, yeah, it is similar. Yeah, I do not have time to explain that. That's a subtle point. Okay. DivaPager has conducted several audit studies essentially doing that. Now, what's an audit study? An audit study, it's a term for when you want to audit like a company or an institution and see whether it's discriminatory or not by sending in applicants for housing or a job or what have you, and then you keep their credentials controlled but manipulate some characteristic that relates to discrimination like their race. And so we call them audit studies because they originated with the government auditing certain institutions with this research practice, trying to see, are you discriminating or not. So experimental studies, so she ran a series of experimental studies where Confederates actually applied for jobs in order to discover whether or not there was racial discrimination. And this is her most recent study. So Diva Bajer had Confederates apply for real low-wage jobs in New York City. And when they went to apply for these low-wage jobs, like jobs at McDonald's or Walmart, what have you, they reported identical qualifications. When they turned in their resumes, they said, these are my qualifications. They were identical. And then they would furthermore, oh man, you can't see all of that? Oh no, you can see essentially all of it. Man, I don't know what's up with that. Okay, yeah, so she had people apply for okay. So they reported essentially identical qualifications and applied to the exact same employers, but she varied whether the applicants were white, black, or Latino. And then other things, would come up, like they would ask you spontaneous questions, like, where do you live? Do you live near here? Things like that. And so she had to extensively train these job applicants to give the same answers, present themselves in the same way. She would videotape them and try and make their responses to these sorts of things exactly uniform before then sending them out into the field to apply for jobs at the same places. So we have white, black, and Latino job applicants to low-wage jobs in New York City being trained to act exactly the same and filling out the resumes in identical ways. And so what happens? Well, in the first study, white, black, and Latino Confederates apply for jobs, and they looked at the rate of positive responses, like the rate of callbacks, cases where employers said, yeah, you look promising, please come back for a second interview. Maybe we'll give you the job then. Maybe we'll just ask you more questions. And here were the results, the rate of positive responses. Whites received a positive response 23% of the time, Latinos 19% of the time, and blacks 13% of the time. This would seem like pretty strong evidence that people of minority races in the contemporary U.S. do face disadvantages in the low-wage labor market, at least in New York City. These people were acting exactly the same. The only thing different was phenotypic, what they look like, the color of their skin. Any questions about this? Okay. So then, Diva Bajer ran another study following this up. And she was interested in what's the magnitude of this effect? Like, how bad is the effect for being a minority in the United States when it comes to applying for low-wage jobs? How extreme is the penalty? Does it compare, for example, to being a felon? If you were to compare the job application success of a white person who was fresh out of prison for some felony, how would that compare with the job market success of blacks and Latinos? So she reran the prior study with now the white person when he or she, I don't remember if they tried both genders or not. It may just be men, or it might just be women. I don't know. But yeah, the white person on the job application. Remember, you know how like on the job application they always ask you if you've been to prison or committed some felony. It's a federal law that has to be on all job applications so that employers can know this. I know you know this because you're always having to fill stuff into that box. So the white felon received a 13% positive response rate, not that high, but then he is, fresh out of prison. And then Latinos a 14%, like about the same, and blacks 10%, about the same, not statistically different from 13%. But this is kind of a stunning result, right? The difference between, there's really no difference between being a white felon and applying for a low-wage job and being a non-felon, not fresh out of prison, but being guilty of being Latino or black. So there were also, the qualitative data around this was very rich and very interesting. There was examples of employers telling black applicants that they were looking for just a different kind of person. They couldn't even put their finger on it necessarily. And one wonders if they did know what it was about the applicant that they didn't like, that the person was African American and they just didn't want to tell the person, or if maybe they didn't even know. Maybe they didn't even know and they just were like, wow, this person isn't exactly the person I want to work with. This isn't exactly the job applicant I was hoping for. But then, in some of these examples, they would hire an identical white applicant who was fresh out of prison the exact same day. There was another case of one of the Confederates going to apply for a job, taking a bus to the site of the job, and waiting at the bus stop afterwards to go back home or back to whatever university they were coming from, like Princeton or something. And they're waiting at the bus stop, and this African-American guy, came out to them and was like, I don't know why you applied for a job there. Everybody knows that they won't hire black people, And they were like, oh, well, academia doesn't know that, so that's why I'm here. So But I mean, a lot of people would be like, oh, that guy's a kook or something, you know, he's just paranoid or something, but he had it exactly right. And that exact employer did not hire that Confederate, but did hire a white Confederate who applied a couple days later. Okay, so Diva Pager's research offers strong evidence in support of the claim that racial discrimination persists in the low-wage labor market. That research was done just like 2 years ago. We have little reason to think that it would all be very different. So there were also, other qualitative things. They found several examples of employers channeling black and Latino applicants into lower status jobs and whites into higher status jobs. So white and black Confederates would come and apply for the same job, and the white applicant would be told, oh, you know, you'd be good for this job. You might want to apply for an even better job, you know. And the black applicants would be told, well, yeah, you'd be okay in this job, but you might want to apply actually to be, the janitor in this office or something. And so being black in the low-wage labor market was about as difficult an impediment to employment as being fresh out of prison. Latinos faced less discrimination than blacks, but were still disadvantaged relative to whites despite identical qualifications and did not receive much better job prospects than a white felon. Questions? Yes? Non-felons, yeah. Yeah. So, did I mean like felons? No, just white felons compared with Latinos and blacks. Yeah, that aren't felons. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did they have any kind of control for the interviewer's race?
I believe they tracked it statistically. Because there could be a concern that maybe that would be somehow confounded with the manipulation, where applicants of a certain race would be channeled into a certain kind of interviewer or something at the same job site, and then it's really a race of interviewer effect or something like that. I think they tracked that, but I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. It's possible that it's something to do with the effect. Something.
She did mention a black employer who rejected a black applicant.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, and to be clear, these employers, some of them are white, many of them are white, but many of them are not white as well. So in a way, this is an example of how status beliefs tend to be shared across a general culture, and we shouldn't be surprised to see that it isn't just white employers that might discriminate against minority job applicants. Other questions? Yes. What's that? Say it again.
For those who are hired for the job, do they tell the employers that they were being
Oh yeah, what they do afterwards? I think what they did was they never accepted a job. If they got a call back, they didn't return the call, and then they mailed, they didn't want to disrupt the hiring process, and then they mailed them a debriefing note later that was like, you were in a study, you didn't know it. We had sent a couple of people to apply for a job a month ago and stuff like that. So they tried to minimize the harm to the employers, though it is certainly possible the employers were slowed a little bit in filling positions if they were really excited about somebody, because their strategy was just don't return any phone calls, which is kind of funny if you think about it. But yeah, okay. Other questions? Okay, so now we've talked about ways in which status differentiates people and drives people apart and can be a basis of discrimination in the low-wage labor market, in the white-collar labor market, in everyday life, in test-taking situations, and so on. And I want to convince you that status is one of the fundamental ways in which, or one of the fundamental bases of discrimination. After the exam, we're going to talk about other bases of discrimination in stereotyping, which are subtly different. They're conceptualized somewhat differently. Stereotyping is an overlapping idea with status, but not exactly the same. But what I want to try and explain to you now is ways in which status maybe brings individuals together. And if you'll remember, early on I said that there were some bases of status differentiation in groups that you might think of as fair. There's ones that are obviously unfair. We shouldn't probably judge the competence of somebody based on their gender or their race, because you should judge people as individuals if you want to get a reliable and valid assessment of how smart they are, how honest they are, and so on. But there's some more meritorious bases of status, and those exist as well. And they have similar effects in terms of determining respect for people, perceptions of competence of people, the influence that people have. But they're the kind of criteria that we wouldn't look down upon so much. Things like intelligence, education, honesty, generosity. And specifically, in this part of the lecture, I want to talk to you about the relationship between generosity and status. And in order to do, and here I'm going to be talking about some of my research, actually, so don't criticize any of what follows, please. No, in actuality, I'm not at all sensitive about that stuff, so feel free to tear into the research or the ideas as you see fit. The idea here is that maybe status plays a role in solving the collective action problem. And what am I talking about with this collective action problem? What is this? Well, the collective action problem is the problem of how it is that groups are able to mobilize individuals to make contributions to them, to the groups. And this is considered this big question, like why is it the case that people make self-sacrificial gestures or behaviors or contributions of time, money, effort to groups when it doesn't pay, right? From a strictly self-interested, material self-interest perspective, from a sort of rational choice, homo economicus, economic man sort of perspective, they shouldn't do this, right? People should be selfish, and they shouldn't make self-sacrificial behaviors that benefit groups but are costly to themselves as individuals. So it's a puzzle, Why is it we do observe that people do make costly contributions to groups, so why do they do it? Let's try to get an answer to it. So we know that the strict self-interest perspective is wrong, but why is it wrong? And so to elaborate a little bit more on the collective action problem, why is it that people contribute to collective action rather than just free riding on other people's contributions? And people talk a lot about the collective action problem because it's very interesting to sociologists. Like, when do people prioritize the group over the individual? We can think of a lot of situations where you act in your own self-interest and maybe don't help the group as much as you could, but when do you do it the other way? When do you help the group and give up your own benefit? So some examples of the collective action problem are as follows. And these are all situations where if people don't transcend their self-interest, if they don't give to the group, then the group is going to do worse, and all the individuals in the group will do worse than if they had just come together and given to the group. So one example is littering. Okay, so we all value, a litter-free world, a world with less pollution, and so on. We all want that, but then every one of us is probably tempted to be selfish and litter and not hold on to our wrappers long enough to get to the trash can and so on. And so at an individual level, you're tempted not to make your contribution to the public good, to just, throw your stuff away wherever you want to, wherever is convenient to you, not expend time and effort throwing it away in the right place. But at the same time, you would value everybody else doing it. But what happens if everybody pursues their narrow self-interest and just throws trash wherever they wish, then we'll have a very ugly world, and we'll all be worse off than if we had just expended the effort to not litter. Also, public protest. You might like some protest, say an anti-war protest or an anti-discrimination protest, or maybe you're a union organizer and you're trying to organize a strike, or you're trying to organize a union to begin with. And you might want that protest or that collective action, that political organizing to be successful and be really big, but you yourself are tempted to stay home, right, and not go to the demonstration, not go to the rally on Saturday, and instead do something else like play Xbox or watch Independence Day, which is on every Saturday. So that's your temptation, right? You're tempted to do that, and what happens if everybody does that? What if everybody gives in to their selfish temptation and doesn't give to the group? Then that means nobody shows up to the demonstration. There is no anti-war rally. The media covers the anti-war rally for the first time because it's unsuccessful. And then you're worse off, and everybody's worse off that values that anti-war rally than if they had just gone. Also, charities. You like charities, right? Or you have certain charities that you value. Maybe pro-choice charities, maybe pro-life charities. Maybe a church that you're a member of. Maybe Hurricane Katrina relief or tsunami relief. And so you would like these charities to do very well. You'd like them to do well and get lots and lots of donations, or maybe a candidate that you support. But you yourself are tempted to take your money and spend it on Thai food, which is, something that you enjoy because you're a smart person. So, but if you do that, if you don't spend your money on the charity and you spend it on just whatever you want for your, for yourself, then what's going to happen is the charity, if everybody makes that same decision, then the charity doesn't prosper. The public good that it provides is never created, and everybody's worse off. We don't have Katrina relief efforts. We don't have tsunami relief efforts, and we could have, and everybody's worse off than if they had just contributed. Or a very pure example would be potlucks. Now, you all are probably young enough to where you don't go to potlucks every Saturday. I'm old enough to where that's all I do. It's one friggin' potluck after another. It's something about turning 30. They're just like, hello, welcome to potluck land. And you're like, oh, lovely. I'll be cooking every Saturday morning until I die. And indeed, that's the world I'm in now. So with potlucks, I don't know if you know about this, I'll tell you, I'm like your informant in the potluck world. This is how it works, okay? In the potluck world, they invite you to dinner, but they're not going to give you dinner. You got to bring the dinner, right? It's a very clever system they have. And everybody is expected to do this. And whoever organizes this, it's kind of like, wow, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to dinner, you know? Because you don't get the dinner, you make the dinner. But the way it works is you bring a dish, everybody, I know you know what a potluck is. But you bring a dish, and then everybody else brings a dish, and then like 2 people show up and don't bring a dish, and everybody's like, those people really suck, you know? And then you have a full dinner because you brought all your food together, and it's good. But what happens if everybody yields to their temptation, acts like those 2 guys that didn't bring their dish? You know, what if nobody brings a dish, then everybody shows up at the potluck, there's no food to eat, everybody's worse off, and they go home and play Xbox. And I guess that's worse, I don't know. So if you want a successful potluck, then you got to contribute, but you're tempted not to contribute. If nobody contributes, then there is no potluck, yada, yada, yada. So all of these examples describe situations where individual and collective interests are at odds, right? In all of these cases, your narrow selfish interests would lead you not to contribute, right? To litter, not go to the public protest, not donate to charity, not bring, you know, brownies to the potluck. Everybody brings brownies, by the way. It's like this disaster of brownies. So that's your narrow self-interest. Now, I'm not saying that's what you would do, but, you know, if we were to isolate your narrow self-interest, that's what it would be. But then the collective interest is at odds with that, right? When does the group do best? The group does best when we don't litter, when we do have the public protest that the group values, when we do donate to the charity that the group values, and when we do successfully sustain a potluck. And sociologists are very interested in situations like these, and social scientists in general are very interested in situations like these where individual and collective interests are at odds. So yes, this is just me saying that again. The problem is if everyone yields to the temptation to be selfish, then collective action fails. The potluck will suck. Katrina relief will be inadequate. Littering's a big problem. The protest goes unattended. And the reason that social scientists are so interested in these specific kinds of cases, or this class of situations, is because it cuts to this fundamental question, this fundamental tension between individual and collective interests. A fundamental question that was isolated by Thomas Hobbes in his book, The Leviathan, where he said that in the state of nature, everyone is selfish, and the result is a world that is nasty, brutish, cruel, and short, or something like that. And so if you're in the state of nature and everybody's pursuing their narrow self-interest, no one's caring about the collective interest, nobody's giving to the group at all, then it would seem impossible for us to ever provide the collective action, the public goods. We'll never have society. I think it's funny, by the way, that he says it's like nasty, brutish, cruel, and short, as though you'd like some longer life in this state of nature or something. It's short. It's short. Nasty, brutish, cruel, and short. So it reminds me of that Woody Allen joke about the 2 women in the restaurant that are like, oh, man, the food here is so awful. And the other one's like, I know, in such small portions. You know, yeah. It's a Woody Allen joke. It's a Woody Allen joke. It's not me. It's Woody. So the Hobbesian state of nature is sort of crystallizes the scenario of what happens if we all pursue our narrow self-interest. And what you get is no society. And so that's why people are interested in the collective action problem, because the collective action problem kind of isolates the question of why society? Why do people even come together in groups to begin with? Why is it that we're social animals? Why is it instead that we're not trapped in that state of nature? You had a question. Right. Okay. So, yeah, the question is, isn't this a very strange conceptualization of the individual? Don't we see that people aren't narrowly self-interested, that they aren't just atomized, isolated individuals? They do care about people. They do have relationships. They do have social goals, social values. And indeed, they're not just, you know, self-interested, right? And in light of that, these are very strange dilemmas. But what I want to convince you of is that these dilemmas are strange, and they are theoretical inventions. You know, the collective action problem and other related social dilemmas, the problem of the state of nature, the question I've posed to you of why society, you know, why does society even happen? I concede readily, they're very strange questions. And why are they strange? They're strange because we see them solved readily in everyday life. We see people overcome their individual interest and bring brownies to the potluck and bring more brownies to the potluck and bring like peanut butter, we see people give to charities. We see people attend public protests. We see society happen all the time. That's all we see, right? And I would argue that it's useful, though, to set up the question of, why does that happen? Just as to not settle for, yes, we are narrowly individually self-interested and atomized individuals, but instead say, why? Why is it we're not like that? What is it? Is it something about human nature that leads us to sustain collective action successfully? Is it something about culture? Is it something about evolution? What is it? Or is it all that stuff? And so I think, in a way, it's a good counterfactual, they would say. We know the world isn't like this, so why isn't it? Okay, so why is it that people overcome their temptation to be selfish and opt instead to give to the group? And one answer that I was interested in investigating during my dissertation research when I was a graduate student was perhaps one of the ways we overcome self-interest is because we're interested in status. We want to be respected by the people around us. We're concerned about being a valued member of groups. We want to get respect, and we want to pursue that respect. And we know that if you just pursue narrow self-interest, if you never go to the protest, but you give them lip service about how you value their public goods, if you don't ever give any money or help out your favorite political candidates, but you do say that you support them, if you never bring food to those potlucks and to those two guys that just eat all the dessert, then you're not going to get much respect, right? And maybe that concern for respect is part of what keeps us in groups pursuing social ends, So what I argued is that giving to the group indicates generosity and concern for others, and we value generosity and concern for others and accord respect to those who exhibit that trait. And recall Nietzsche's ideas about virtue here, right? He said that in ancient Rome, what was virtuous, what was considered good about an individual, what we respected about people, was when they were powerful and strong and successful, and in a sense, self-empowered, self-interested, right? But what we respect after the rise of Judeo-Christian ethics is more generosity, self-sacrifice for the group, and so on. And I was influenced by these readings and was interested in systematically testing what you might call Nietzsche's solution to the collective action problem. So in order to do this, I set up a very, very artificial experiment that kind of isolated the basic incentive structure of the collective action problem in an artificial setting, which should be familiar to some of you because I have a graduate student who did follow-up research on this semester, and some of you participated in a study that he was running. So in the studies that I ran, when I was a graduate student at Cornell University, I set up a collective action or group task situation where everyone was given an endowment of resources that they could contribute to some group, or they could keep it. They could keep their resources and free ride on the other people's contributions. And the rules of the game went as follows. Everyone had an endowment of $5, and on each round they could invest some of that money in a pool. If they did invest in the pool, then that money would be doubled and then split equally amongst everyone. If they didn't invest in the pool, they could keep whatever they didn't invest and then also get their share of the pool. So do you understand? Well, there's no reason you should understand this yet. Here's the incentives that sets up. If everybody's narrowly self-interested, then they won't invest anything in the pool, right? You won't give anything to the group because it's just going to benefit other people, and you only get a fraction of it back. But what happens then? If nobody overcomes their self-interest and gives to this central pool, then as a result, everybody leaves with that same $5 endowment they started with. But if instead people overcome their self-interest and do give to the group, then that everybody's $5 goes into the central pool, it gets doubled, and then split equally amongst everyone, and everybody goes home with twice what they started with. And so everybody's better off. But if you were really crafty and self-interested, you'd still prefer not to give, right? Because if you don't give, then you keep your $5, everybody else gives, it gets doubled, and then you get your share of that, right? So you get the most money if you don't give and everybody else does. That's why you'd like to be that guy at the potluck eating brownies but didn't have to spend the morning cooking. That would be the ideal, well, if you're narrowly self-interested. So this is the way it works. This is the setup. Everyone's tempted to free ride based on some sort of self-interest motive, but if everybody pursues that self-interest motive, then the group is worse off, and everybody says, oh, I wish we had all just contributed. Can you wake that guy up? He's missing college. Thank you. Welcome back, sir. So, he's not happy. Okay. So the results of this study were the following. Those who gave more to the group So this is the question, right? Like, if you give more to the group, will you be more respected? And those who gave more to the group were more respected. They were seen as higher status. We had people rate the status of high and low contributors. And they also had more influence in a subsequent group task. They were given more resources when people were given a chance to be altruistic towards them. And they were cooperated with more in cooperation situations later. So if the question is, why is it that you would overcome your narrow self-interest and contribute to the group? Well, one answer is it would actually pay. You'd actually be better off, you know? You would actually be respected more. You'd have more influence in the group. You'd be allocated more resources and future opportunities. People would cooperate with you more. They'd like you more. I mean, why is it that you'd bring something to the potluck? Well, one of the reasons is it makes pretty damn good sense to bring something to the potluck. You'll be liked, respected, cooperated with, treated altruistically, and you'll have influence over others. Yes, it will cost you a little bit of time, effort, resources, what have you, but you get to be accepted into groups as a result. In study B, I did a follow-up study as well, and it was the exact same study, except after people gave their ratings of what they thought of all the contributors in the group, what they thought about the people who gave a lot and the people who didn't give much when put in this collective action situation. After that, I gave the subjects in the study real feedback, well, false feedback, which they believed to be real, on what everybody had thought of them. So we say, okay, what do you think, about these high contributors, these low contributors, these people who contribute in the middle? How much do you respect them? And people said, well, I respect the high contributors. I don't respect the low contributors. They didn't do any. They didn't overcome their self-interest. They're jerks. They didn't bring anything to the potluck. And then I say, okay, here's what these people thought of you. And half the time they were told that the other group members had respected them at a very high level, that they were very respected by the group. And half the time they were told, nah, the people didn't respect you very much, actually. And then I said, now let's do some more of this collective action situation. Let's have a few more opportunities for you to contribute to the group, or not. And what we found, or what I found, was that when participants got feedback that indicated that other people respected them, they tended to give more to the group after that. They also identified with the group more, and they saw the group as having more solidarity and being more cohesive. So this is sort of me trying to figure out what are the effects of respect, right? Like I'm telling you that contributions to the group earn individuals respect. Well, what does that do? What's the result? Does that solve the collective action problem? Does that lead people? Does that motivate people to give more to the group subsequently? Well, it does. It does. If you overcome your self-interest and give to the group, you'll probably find that people will respect you afterwards. And having received that respect, you'll then be more motivated to help the group. You'll make bigger contributions to the group, and you'll like the group more. You'll identify with it, perceive it as having solidarity, and so on. And so this sort of highlights a virtuous cycle, where giving leads to respect, which leads to more giving. And maybe this cycle is part of what explains how we overcome the collective action problem. That we give to the group at time one for some reason. Perhaps we anticipate respect, perhaps some other motivation of ours. This is not the only reason people give to groups. But then having given, we get respect, and that respect propels our future costly contributions to group efforts. I don't think we really have time for this. This is a path diagram from the paper, but basically this traces the logic of the argument. That individuals make collective action contributions. This leads to perceptions by other group members that the person is motivated to help the group, that they're high in group motivation. Then, in turn, that leads to higher status standing. So you see people contribute, you assume they're motivated to help the group, then you hold them in higher esteem in the group. That higher status standing leads the individual to have more influence over others and also receive more cooperation and altruistic gifts from group members. Then it leads to expressions of respect as well. Those expressions of respect, in turn, increase the individual's motivation to help the group, and then that motivation actually leads to further collective action contributions, leading to a virtuous cycle. So it looks like that. Any questions about this? Okay. And to kind of drive home the point, I want to highlight the larger takeaway here and reconnect this to the question of why society. Why is it that we do overcome narrow self-interest to achieve society? Why does society ever even happen? And how many of you have read Jean-Paul Sartre's play No Exit? Okay. So do any of you remember the most famous quote from No Exit, or what the big takeaway of that play is? Yes. Exactly. Hell is other people. And which is a pretty, uplifting story, main takeaway. This is a fun play, hell is other people. And what Sartre's talking about is that nobody can get to you, can get under your skin, can torment you as much as other people. Because by nature, you're a social animal. And if you were to find yourself in hell, should it exist and should you wind up there, that hell is going to be hellish to you because of social reasons. Because nobody can get to you the way other people can. Maybe you'd like to just decide one day to be happy. Or to be content, or to have high self-esteem, or to be confident, or achieve your goals. But you can't just decide to do that, because you're embedded in a larger society, a series of situations, a bunch of relationships. And all of those things, your self-esteem, your happiness, and so on, are socially created. They're created by you in conjunction with the people around you, and the only route that you could find to the things that you want would have to be social routes. You would have to work with the people around you to make yourself higher in self-esteem, have good relationships, be happy, be confident, and so on. So Sartre's saying that that which torments you is probably social. And he has this whole story about people finding themselves in hell and finding themselves in a very social hell. But one of the biggest things that he's highlighting here is that we as human beings have a fundamental regard for what other people think of us. And this is an idea that shouldn't be new to you as sociologists, right? Like George Herbert Mead talks about this when he talks about the generalized other. Charles Horton Cooley talks about this when he talks about the looking glass self. He says, we find out who we are by looking at others and seeing them see us. And that's how we figure out who we are. Or Freud talks about this with the superego, that society, the society that kind of hangs around in your head. Or Foucault's panopticon. These are all versions of the idea that you can't have a pure self-regard. You can't see yourself purely the way you would want to. Instead, society is in your head. And I think I told you earlier that example of, when you, that one time I sat down in my chair in my office and missed the chair and like fell on my ass, And I actually blushed, I got not just embarrassed, but I physically blushed. And there was nobody there. Nobody saw it except me, but I was seeing myself through other people's eyes. And try to go home tonight and dance just as silly, ridiculously as possible in front of a mirror and see if you can do it. Like, you can't do it, You can't do it. I mean, some of you can do it more than others. Certainly all of you can do it more than me. But you'll be judging yourself. You'll be seeing yourself. You'll be embarrassed, even though there's no one there, right? And shut all the blinds. I advise you do. Shut the curtains, and you can't do it. You can't ever get society out of your head. And in that way, we're tormented, right? Socially, we're tormented. Other people are in our heads. We can't get them out. And we're pursued by other people's regard for us. But I argue here that at the end of that pursuit, we find ourselves in groups with the potential for communion with others, with the potential for solidarity with others, with the potential to achieve and create society. And so while there's this obvious downside that hell is other people, that people are in your head and you can't just have your own perspective on yourself, that you're always seeing it through the lens of other people's perspective, and that society can't be gotten out, that it's also the case that in a way heaven is sort of other people, because that torment drives you into social settings that are the source of happiness, solidarity, cooperation, productivity, and all of society. And that would be a sort of social contract, a contract that you sort of sign with yourself when you're born with this fundamental social nature, and a very sociological social contract. So, some general conclusions about status, because that isn't general enough. We should be more general than that. Status hierarchies are relative. You may be a certain status standing in this room, but you'll walk into another room and you'll be a different status standing. With your family, you have a different status standing. In your apartment, you have a different one, and so on. Status hierarchies are relative, and the same person with the same traits could be high or low or middle status in different settings. The power of the situation again, right? Also, status standing is based on both meritorious characteristics, but also bases of discrimination. So we respect people in part because of maybe how honest they are, how generous they are, but we also respect people for the wrong reasons, like what their gender is and what their race is. Status characteristics are culturally determined. This was Nietzsche's idea, right? That across time and history and cultures, people respect different things about people. In ancient Rome, we respected different things about people than we do now. And indeed, we respect different things about people now than we did 40 years ago. And it's going to be different again in 40 more years. Status has many effects on how individuals are perceived and treated. People with higher status are allocated more chances to speak, they have more influence, and so on. Status leads to discrimination. That's one of the things status leads to. Higher status people are treated better in society than lower status people. But, and this is the research I highlighted in Status Study 4, status is also earned for generous behavior, for pro-social behavior, for giving to the community and transcending self-interest, overcoming narrow self-interest and being a pro-community person. And then that might be part of the fundamental social fabric that helps us come together in groups in pursuit of respect and positive regard from the people that we care about. So status in this way has good and bad effects that we should be mindful of. And so we should be careful to resist status's bad effects, the discriminatory effects that it can have, and be careful to evaluate individuals as individuals and not simply in terms of their status positions or diffuse characteristics they have, like race and gender and sexual orientation and so on, or age or what have you, or attractiveness, and judge them on those. We should try to transcend that and judge them as individuals. But also, we should take advantage of the good parts of status to make society and groups that we inhabit run well. And that means being sure that you do give credit where credit's due. When you see pro-social behaviors or generous behaviors that you value, where people give to ends that you value and people give to groups that you inhabit, that you benefit from, you should be careful to give them proper respect for overcoming their self-interest and giving to these groups that you're concerned about. Okay, so now let's take a couple-minute break. We'll pass out the review for the second exam, and then we'll regroup and do the review. All right, does everybody have, if I get your attention, we should get started. Let's be very efficient so that we can maximize your access to to basically the answers. So that got your attention. Okay, so if you don't have an exam sheet, please raise your hand. We'll get one to you. Okay, cool. Now, as before, you cannot ask clarifying questions about the material over email. It's simply the wrong venue in which to ask questions. And don't send them to Nora. Don't send them to me. We won't respond. Or you might get a one-sentence response saying, we told you that we won't respond over email. So now is your time to ask clarifying questions should you have them, and I'd be delighted to answer your questions. Remember that the idea of this class is there is no hidden agenda. The material should all be laid in front of you, be as understandable as possible, and you're given every opportunity to know it so that you can kick butt on the exam, which I'd love to see. I'd love for all of you to do terrifically on the exam. I should say one thing, which is that this exam, as compared with the prior one, there'll be a little bit more emphasis on the multiple choice questions. There'll be a few more multiple choice questions. They'll have a bigger impact on your grade. What does that mean? That means you need to be sure you've done all the readings. Obviously, you need to be sure you've done all the readings. But especially for the second exam, we'll be testing the readings even more closely because we didn't end up having a quiz in the second period. So now you need to know that. Okay, so be sure you know all the readings so you can ace the multiple choice. We'd love to see you do that. Question? Yes, sir. The Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem appears in Roles and Identities in Zimbardo, I think, Stanford Prison Study, I think. Yeah, the Thomas theorem is the idea that if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. That what matters in interaction and for social outcomes is the subjectively perceived reality, not whatever the objective reality is. So it was brought up in this case because in the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, what we found is that these people aren't really in a prison. They're just being told, you're going to play the part of a prison guard or a prisoner for a couple weeks, and they took to it feverishly because they believed the situation to be real, and then it became very real in its consequences. Prisoners were tortured, essentially tortured, mentally abused. Prison guards acted like jerks, and so on. So situations believed to be real become real in their consequences. Yes, ma'am? Excellent question. One of the matching multiple choice questions is ABC Primetime Live film of Milgram replication. You should know the basic findings. So this is a tricky one. I'm glad you asked that question. This is a tricky one in that it's relevant to the second exam, but it actually came in the first third of the class during when I had to go to a social psychology conference. Can anybody summarize what was the main finding or findings from that study? Besides the guys with otter t-shirts don't kill people. Which is reassuring. Yeah. That's exactly right. Times have not changed with respect to people following orders in situations to even the extreme extent that's shown in the Milgram experiment where people will electrocute somebody essentially to death based on small provocations. So they found about the same rates of obedience when they replicated the study at Santa Clara University as they did when they ran it at Yale in the early 1960s. So times have not particularly changed for behavior in the Milgram study. Yes? Oh, well, the happiness hypothesis is under all readings here. So if you look on the first page, it says matching multiple choice questions, and it lists concepts from lecture, where I'm directing you to specific concepts in lecture, and then you're also responsible for all the readings, and then I just list them, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that. I'm just saying, what specifically should we be thinking about from the book?
The intro in chapters 1 through 8. I understand why you're asking, but I'm not going to answer that. I'm sympathetic. The questions are constructed in such a way that if you have read these materials, then you'll do great, and if you haven't, you're going to not do great. So, yeah. Like a quiz, essentially. Because my main goal is to get you to just read this stuff. I would like you to deeply comprehend it and think about it creatively and analytically and deeply and stuff like that, but I mostly want to know that, are you reading this stuff? Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, other than, he also includes a lot of extra training information or stuff other than what you included in the lecture. Do you focus more on the stuff that you included in the lecture as we reread it, or should we focus on, consider the training stuff?
This is an excellent, excellent question. For the Jonathan Turner reading about Irving Goffman, which is called Dramaturgical Theory, and talks about dramaturgical theory, but also talks about some other stuff as well that's related to Goffman, you want to read that and know what's going on in that reading, not just the parts that I talk about in lecture. It's a more thorough treatment of dramaturgical theory than you got from lecture by far. It refers to more parts of his theories, his books. It talks about books that he wrote like Frame Analysis and behavior in public places, relations in public. So you want to read that and comprehend it. Not just the stuff from class. More questions about the rubric? Yes.
Can you please define the accentuation effect?
Yeah. So the accentuation effect. Well, I can with help here. Hold on. Can I define the accentuation effect? I could pick it out of a list. Okay. So the accentuation effect is it's a tendency to exaggerate similarity within groups and exaggerate dissimilarity between groups. So when we see objects, be they human beings or non-material objects or non-human animals or what have you, we'll tend to perceive them, when they're presented as being in groups, we tend to perceive the groups as pretty homogeneous, and then those groups as being pretty different from one another, just because they're presented in groups. I actually lost who asked that question, so I'm just talking randomly into this guy. I'm looking like I'm talking to somebody, but I'm not anymore. Sorry about that. Is that clear about the accentuation effect? Cool. Yes? Sure. Yeah, the accent. No. Somebody said, wait, that's a little bit confusing. What about the connection to the perception of humans, social cognition? No, that's what I mean by the accentuation effect for the purposes of the class, is the tendency to see anything, though we're specifically interested in humans, as being more similar within groups when they're presented as being in groups, and then more dissimilar between groups, again, when they're presented as being in groups than when they're not. And then if you could imagine you're in one of these groups, that's going to lead you towards out-group stereotyping, and also to a certain extent in-group stereotyping as well. You'll tend to see your group as typified by a few traits. You'll see yourself as similar to the other people in the group. You'll see the people in your group as similar to one another. And then you'll see the other group as very different, but they're all just like one another. I mean, they're all the same, right? And they're all very different from us. But if you didn't have that group categorization, you wouldn't do it that way. Yeah. More questions about the, yes? Yeah. Yeah.
prisoners. They know they're a bunch of college kids, so how can they really kind of take this so far
Yeah.
with results?
No, and I appreciate your point. So the point is the Stanford prison experiment really a good example of the Thomas theorem, given that, you know, they're being told to play the part of a prison guard or a prisoner? Didn't they not believe the situation to be real, and yet it still became real, and its consequences might, in fact, I'm taking your point further than you even, but, you know, might this actually be a good counterexample to the Thomas theorem, where situations can become real in their consequences, even when they're not believed to be real? It's a very smart point. That's a tough point. I conceded. I would say, okay, so I'd bail it out in two ways. So one thing I'd say, I think the Thomas theorem, I wanted to bring it up at some point because I think it's a pretty cool idea, and I think it's pretty true. And I think in everyday life, yes, you know, you can misperceive a situation and you'll act on that misperception, not the real situation. And so the consequences will be the consequences of your misperception of the situation, not the real situation. So I buy the Thomas theorem in general, and, you know, so I'll apologize for the Thomas theorem, even if Zimbardo isn't the perfect example of it. But I would also say that the Zimbardo experiment is still a pretty good example of it, because if you pay attention to some of the interview data that came out in the documentary, they had prisoners who were like, I lost track of reality. Like, I thought I really was in this prison. I started, you know, even when no one's looking and there's no reason for me to be doing this, I'm counting the days on the wall, you know. I could leave at any time. I wanted to leave. I was a prisoner. By definition, I wanted to leave, and I didn't say anything to leave. You know, a guy tried to break out of the prison. Doesn't make any sense. Why do you break out of the prison when you could just say, oh, by the way, on the consent form it says I can leave at any time. I'd like to do that now. Likewise, Zimbardo says, I started to really believe I was a prison, you know, a warden of a prison, and so on. So I think, yeah, it's not the perfect example of the Thomas theorem, but especially when the people are saying, I started to believe it really was real, and then it became real in the way they behaved afterwards, then in that way it'd be a good example of the Thomas theorem. Excellent question. Yeah.
What if the fine line was when somebody treats you and it's being, you know, invasive to you and it is real?
Mm-hmm.
It becomes, you know,
Right. Yeah.
roll a sign to invasive or not.
Yep. When you're treated well or badly by others, that can become real in its consequences, even if you think you're better than that, or worse than that if you're being treated well. Yeah. Yes. The question is, can I go over the effects of proximity for the Milgram experiment? Yes, I can. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Where is it? Okay. Yeah, so proximity in the Milgram experiment matters in two ways, both the proximity of the victim and the proximity of authority. And I think the question taps both, right? Yeah. So proximity of victim matters, possibly for the following reasons, because when the victim is closer, you're more like aware that this is a real situation. You'd be less able to say, oh, maybe there isn't really somebody I'm electrocuting, when you're pushing their hand down on a hot plate and they're flailing like crazy. Also, we found people feel more empathy for victims that are more proximal to them, or anything that's more proximal to them. You know, like, it's one thing to know that someone's dying in a civil war somewhere on a different continent, but when you see it dead in front of your eyes, it'll have a much bigger impact on you. So proximity affects empathy, which may also be one of the reasons that when the victim is closer, people electrocute them less. Also, greater feeling of responsibility. You might be able to say, I'm just pressing buttons, they lead to a death somewhere else. I feel somewhat responsible for that, but not totally responsible. But when they're right in front of you and you can see the direct effect of your behavior on the outcome, then you feel very responsible for it. And then the evidence for the proximity of victim mattering comes from earlier in here, right, where I presented results from different conditions, including right. Okay. So in one condition, you know, the learner is in another room, and the teacher tends to electrocute them all the way to the XXX level at almost 100%. Then when they're in the same, or when they're being audio taped in, then you electrocute them less. When they're sitting 1.5 feet away from you, you electrocute them even less. And then finally, the condition that had among the lowest rates of compliance with the orders from the authority was when you have to actually press their hand down on like a shock plate. I, again, do not understand why people didn't think they would be electrocuted by that. I don't, right? Okay, so In any event, yeah, so that's the idea of proximity of victim matters. As the victim is getting closer, subjectively closer, you electrocute them less. Don't pack up. Don't pack up. You still have time to get like answers to the exam. Yeah, it's not in your interest to pack up. Yes, ma'am. Goffman's backstage is an idea that's presented, you know, obviously in the rules, and which I didn't pop up somehow. Or maybe I did. No, I didn't. Okay, Goffman's backstage is this idea highlighted with a Fyodor Dostoevsky quote that, well, it's sort of an extension of his dramaturgical analysis. Did I pass it? I did, didn't I? There we go. That there's things that we don't share with others. Ha, wow, you just learned that today, right? Yeah, welcome to sociology. Okay, so welcome to the works of Irving Goffman. So Goffman has this larger theory that it's useful to perceive society and social interaction situations in terms of people putting on play, you know, and taking roles and performing them as fluently as they can in everyday life. And as an extension of that, he says that sometimes there's some stuff where we're on the front stage, where we're on stage and we're playing our role. But then also there's a backstage, and your backstage might be when you're alone by yourself and behaving differently than you would in front of anybody else, or when you're with close, intimate confidants or partners, or you know, or a husband or a wife or what have you. Then you might let them in on some you know, deeper parts of yourself or whatever. So that's the backstage. Other questions? Yes. Yes, trends in obedience. The trends in obedience is, it's from this slide. It's from the Milgram obedience study. If people are coming in from another class, you mind waiting until this class is over? Okay, so this is based on research in Middletown, Muncie, Indiana, though you're not supposed to know that. It's a big secret. And these are trends in the valuation of obedience over time from 1900, estimated by people reporting in 1924 to 1924 to 1954 to 1978. And there's this tendency for obedience as a value we want to raise our kids with to decline over this period of time, and for independence as a value we try to raise kids with to increase over time. That's basically it. And then I'm going to have to go after this, or we're going to have to end after this. Yeah.
After the power, there's only slides that the power situation with is that what you're talking about? Are you just talking about in general?
When I talk about the power of the situation, am I only talking about the Rosenhan experiment? I am talking about the idea of the power of the situation, which is laid out in the Zimbardo lecture. It's defined in there. And then also one specific application of it is the Rosenhan experiment, which you're responsible for. Any quick questions? Yes? Yes? You got to talk louder. Oh, the basic setup of the Milgram obedience study is the methods of the Milgram obedience study as laid out in the presentation.